It's my pleasure now to introduce the next panel. Dr. Amber Mace is the moderator. She's the Chief Executive Officer of the California Council on Science and Technology. And joining her is Marie Liu, who is the Policy Advisor to the California Speaker of the Assembly, and Louise Bedsworth at the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. This is up and down, so you can just adjust it as you wish.
Thank you so much. I love this. I want to play with this just a little bit. Hi, everyone. Good morning. So delighted to be here with you this year and to participate last year as well as this year. My name's Amber Mace, and I am here with two wonderful panelists, and I'm going to get to them quickly, and I know we're going to try to catch up a little bit on time. Before we do that, I want to say a little bit about the California Council on Science and Technology and provide a brief bit of context for this panel today. So for those of you who aren't aware of the organization, the California Council on Science and Technology is a nonpartisan nonprofit. It was created 35 years ago at the request of the California legislature to be a resource to California state policymakers, to draw on the incredible knowledge that's created throughout the extensive network of expert academic and research institutions throughout California. We are so lucky to have California just blessed with incredible network of researchers and institutions in the community colleges, the California State University system, the UC system, our private universities, our national labs. It's just phenomenal. So we're delighted to partner with the California State University Bakersfield, such a wonderful location and host. You've made so much progress in this space. We're delighted to be a partner. We're also delighted to see some of our other partner institutions here, Lawrence Livermore National Lab, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and maybe some others that I haven't had a chance to meet. I hope I get to meet you. So thank you for your partnership and all of the knowledge that you're creating. So this is where the knowledge comes from. We come in to help make sure that this knowledge gets translated into useful, actionable policy advice for state policymakers in the legislature, the executive branch. And we do that in a number of different ways. We do that through convening our experts to share information in workshops and in briefings and developing deep dives into peer-reviewed reports. We also have a policy fellowship program where we bring PhD scientists and engineers for a year of public service and leadership training to Sacramento. And they come from all over the US and all over the world. And we have a couple of the alums in the audience today. You're going to hear from Dr. Nusha Ajami later this afternoon. She is an alum of the fellowship program. And also Dr. John Thompson, who is our lead at CCST for partnerships. If you haven't had a chance to meet him, where I don't see where he is. Where is John? He's right over there. All right. Make sure you introduce yourself to John. And he is the brains behind this panel and a lot of what we do at CCST. So today, we have already heard about some of the geologic context, so the history, the geology, some of the physics, and some of the infrastructure. And our panel is an opportunity to share with you some of the policy context. And as you know, there have been a lot of really ambitious climate policies developed and enacted. In fact, last year, a number of new policies were put into place that Governor Newsom signed. How many of you have heard of SB 905? Okay, just a handful. That's good, because we have a couple policy experts who can share more with you about that piece of legislation. Also, the California Air Resource Board adopted the 2022 scoping plan that creates a pathway, a framework, and a roadmap for how California can meet its carbon neutrality goals by 2045, and that's also been codified, making that an official goal of the state of California. So in that scoping plan, carbon management, carbon sequestration, all the different acronyms that you're going to hear today are mentioned in that plan as important tools in the toolbox for meeting the carbon neutrality goals. So our experts today are here to share a little bit of that policy context and to answer some of your questions. So I have a lot of questions for them. I'm going to ask some first, and then we'll try to make sure we save some time for you to ask some as well. So without further ado, I'm going to ask my expert panelists here to introduce themselves, share a little bit about their background, and then I'm going to launch into some questions. Louise, you go first. Dr. Louise Bedsworth.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Louise Bedsworth. I'm Executive Director of the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment at UC Berkeley. And we're a research center that sits within the law school. And we're really focused on sort of unsticking the sticky problems and focusing on implementation of climate and environmental solutions. We do our work through dialogue and partnership and convening. We do research, and we also do a lot of training and education, working with students across the university. We operate an AmeriCorps program that puts recent college graduates into rural communities throughout California, focused actually on regenerative agriculture and wildfire resilience. But our focus is really on asking the how questions. We really tend not to do research for the sake of research, but really to help us understand how we can start moving forward and making progress. Our focus is often on governance and finance, and we take a very interdisciplinary approach. So while we sit in the law school, we bring together engineers and scientists and lawyers and policymakers and community groups and just everyone who can have a part in the solution. Prior to joining the Center for Law, Energy, Environment, or CLE, because that's a bit of a mouthful, I worked for the state of California for 10 years in the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and then most recently as Executive Director of the California Strategic Growth Council. So a lot of my personal interest is very much on how we're leading and implementing innovative new approaches to community-led and community-based approaches to environmental problem solving. And so really looking at how we can navigate our transition with a lot of these new technologies, like we're talking about today, in a way that really puts community and people first and foremost in the design of our solutions. I'll turn to Marie.
Hi, my name is, thanks for having me. My name is Marie Liu. I'm an advisor to the Assembly Speaker, Anthony Rendon. I've worked in the legislature for a little over 2 decades, almost all of that time focused on environmental issues, including climate, natural resources, particularly within the climate areas. One of my roles is to actually try to, maybe similar to CLE, is actually try to watch the cross-sector issues when dealing with kind of our myriad of climate challenges and opportunities.
Excellent, wonderful. So first, some more a context-setting question for you. As you know, and all of us know, there are some really bold climate policy goals from the state of California. Can you talk a little bit about how carbon management fits into those goals, and talk a little bit about how the distinction between the natural sequestration versus other technological solutions fit into the carbon management plans for the state? Marie, would you like to start?
Sure. I think between legislation and ARB's activities on the scoping plan and various executive orders, I think there's a lot of recognition in state government that carbon management needs to be part of our climate solutions. I think it's very hard for the general public and frankly for policymakers too to grasp the scope of what we need to do in order to hit our very ambitious and very necessary climate goals. There is, and because those goals are so ambitious and so necessary, along with the passage of SB 905 actually last year was also the passage of a bill that set a 2045 net neutrality goal for the state of California. And within that goal was a requirement that 85% of that goal be reached through actually emission reductions. And so that is, so that's kind of the context about why we're talking everything. So 85% must come from emission reductions. We also recognize that means the other part, the other 15%, and then the endless amount into getting into carbon negative we need kind of all technologies on the table. But in order to get to these ambitious goals, I think there's a broad recognition that we need a whole suite of different options on the table. There's also the recognition that each of these options have different pros and cons for the legislature. They have different policy questions in terms of what are the liabilities involved, where does the state and our public dollars need to be most invested in too. So we're trying to grapple with just trying to balance a whole lot of priorities while looking at trying to grapple with balancing all these different priorities and looking at so many new technologies coming very quickly for the legislature's consideration.
Can you build off of that and also touch on your insights into the natural sequestration versus technological solutions? And then I'd love for you to expand a little bit on what Marie was just saying about what are some of the trade-offs and how you think about those in terms of balancing all of these options.
Yeah, when I think about when the law that establishes their carbon neutrality target tied together two other pieces of legislation, SB 905, which is establishing the regulatory framework for thinking about, for shorthand, sort of more the engineered side of carbon removal, but then also legislation around establishing targets for natural carbon sequestration, so storing carbon in forests, in wetlands, in soils. And I think, just in very simply creates this framework that is showing all of these pieces are necessary, with the focus on emission reductions really as the bulk of how we're going to reach our target. The state of California has been doing a lot more work over the previous scoping plan and even before on the natural and working lands side of the equation, and sort of really thinking about there's the climate smart land strategy and how we're taking advantage of our natural systems, protecting and restoring them to store carbon. And that's been technically challenging because the accounting and everything is quite different from our traditional inventorying methodologies. And I think it's been over a decade of, I think we're getting to where we're really trying to solidify what that element is going to look like. And we're in a similar place now on the engineered side of really thinking about how are we building the framework, how are we thinking across, much like we have a number of different ecosystems, we have a number of different sectors that we're trying to hit. And in early iterations of SB 905, which may have had a different number, you probably would know, but a focus really did start with cement. And that is because it's been raised here a lot. It is it's an industry that we need. And there are certainly innovations that can help us think about how we're using CO2 and doing innovative new materials. But it's sort of one of our more no regrets areas of work. And so I think you saw even with that starting discussion on SB 905, a focus on things we know we need to do so we can start focusing there and then build out into some of our more challenging sectors that we're trying to navigate. So I think the framework is now really in place, and especially on the engineered side, it's a matter of, we have the pipeline question and the SB 905, the report that the Resources Agency sent to the legislature, we're getting that underway, but that's quite, as was noted in the previous panel, quite a long time from now. And so as we're working on that, how do we start working on the things we know we want to do, the things we know we can do, to buy us time to figure out some of these more challenging questions?
I love that. We're definitely going to come back to that piece because I want to hear more about it. Marie, can you take a moment and say a little bit more about what SB 905 is and isn't?
Sure. So last year there was a package of bills. Louise mentioned also there was the natural-based solution planned set up. 905 was one of this package of bills that was passed. 905 really I would say there's kind of two parts of it. One is some legal, there were some statutory and legal challenges that we had to address, particularly with carbon sequestration, geologic storage, to deal with some of the ownership issues. And so 905 addressed, at least in a limited context, how we manage ownership, and also put kind of very broad framework on legal liabilities and testing. The other side of 905, I think, is kind of a little more broad and a little bit more nebulous, maybe, to a certain extent by design, in recognition of the fast evolving world of technologies within CCUS and CDR. And that is to direct ARB to develop a program that, one, has a unified application for all the state agencies that have a different part in permitting. And then also just to give ARB some general direction to look at and explore these different technologies, partly to give information to the legislature, but also partly to develop information to help inform regulations going forward.
And that's the Air Resources Board. I'm going to be also the acronym monitor, or CARB, California Air Resources Board. Yes, that's great. And when you say ownership, can you talk about why that's an issue, the above ground versus below ground?
Well, for one thing, outside of the context of LCFS, California hasn't really dealt. Oh, thank you. Sorry, I'm gonna.
Thank you.
I was like, acronym, please. That was my second violation. Third strikes, I'm out. And aside from the low carbon fuel
standard,
LCFS, standard, darn it. California really hasn't dealt with thinking about, well, what happens when you put it in the ground? Does it belong to is it the person who owns the surface of the land, or is it the person who put it there in the first, the organization that put the carbon there in the first place? And why this is important is in part to think about kind of long-term liability, which is important in the state to think of, we control the public dollars. When things go wrong, and if we don't properly hold the right people accountable, the state pays for it. So that us as taxpayers pay for it. And so so you need to figure out the ownership, not just so you can have permission to put it in there and figure out who has the right to say yes and who has the right to say no, but also to figure out how we protect the public generally from a fiscal and policies standpoint.
Great, thank you. Now, both of you have training background as scientists, and and many scientists and technical experts in the room, though we know that and even though the California Council on Science and Technology is all about science and technology advice for policymaking, we know that that is not the only thing that informs policy. Louise, I'd like to have you start and talk a little bit about what are some of the other factors that policymakers must think about and consider when they're developing policy, particularly policy that has a very technical component to it.
There's many. I think when you're especially, excuse me, especially when you're thinking about citing something in a place, you really have to take a place-based approach to thinking about how technology is going to work in a given situation. Of course, we always are thinking about cost, equity implications, all of those pieces. But I think some of our challenges now are the technologies we're looking at are not as simple as, let's just use an example, we're controlling tailpipe emissions and you're putting a catalytic converter on a car. That we've moved to a new realm of where we're really looking at technologies that have systems implications that are drawing on really integrated and complex approaches to how we're handling a given problem. And so you have to then take a much more systems approach to thinking about how that technology would be deployed. How is it going to affect a place, the people in that place, jobs? And you're hearing all of this conversation happening today, and I think that's why in this instance you can have a whole day and much more to talk about this, because it is really complex and we need to think about how are we navigating. It's not job for job, it's job quality and job quality. It's all of these important considerations. And I think importantly, thinking about, we saw in the first presentation, the legacies that communities also are experiencing. And so how are we taking an approach to a transition that is, we have an opportunity to do this differently. We have an opportunity not to put communities at the mercy of this transition, but put them front and center to benefit from this transition. And that means we need to really think in a different way that is more people-centered. It is really about those, what those benefits are. And that's not the way we've approached transition and technology in the past. And so we have a tremendous opportunity at this moment in time to do things differently. And so we can't obviously take forever, but taking a moment and doing that thinking about how we are looking at these technological solutions in a new way and in a systems way, I think is going to be critically important so that 50 years from now, we're not looking back at the same types of challenges we're seeing today.
I think I want to quote Donald Rumsfeld, who says, we have knowns, we have knowns, and we have known unknowns, and we have unknowns unknowns. I didn't get the quote as right as what, but I think actually about that quote a lot, especially in this context, because I think as policymakers, members need to hear not only what we know, but what we already acknowledge what we don't know. And an acknowledgement of where there's the uncertainties involved. Working on toxics legislation, I feel like we spend a lot of energy and a lot of money, and have to work with a lot of communities who have suffered decades of impacts because we didn't regulate the thing that we thought because we weren't looking. And I think in particular, many of you have heard of, I'm going to use an example from the southeast Los Angeles, Exide pollution, which, they operated for 80 years before we even recognized that lead was the toxic air contaminant in the air. And it has cost hundreds of millions of dollars to provide a good amount of remediation, but by no means can we undo the decades of impacts that we've done, that lead pollution caused on families and the community. So when it comes to, when we have an opportunity here as these technologies continue to kind of develop on a larger scale for our regulatory structures not to chase the after the potential side effects, but actually to be in front of it. So what's really helpful when you guys when you all are doing research on different technologies is to hear kind of the full picture of when you make it, when there are assumptions made, what are those assumptions? And how could those assumptions break down? It doesn't make, obviously it doesn't make your research less valuable, but it helps policymakers kind of understand better how to kind of pro and con, how to weigh these options amongst many other options that they have when trying to reach our climate goals.
I'm going to push on that just a little bit and ask you to elaborate, since policymakers are, as you say, inundated with information. There's just so much information coming from so many different sources. Where do policymakers get information that they trust? How does that work? What does that look like?
Well, one place they get it is actually from our higher education system. Definitely, I think, Bakersfield starting, your center here on energy management, I think is something that members will definitely turn to. We turn to places like CCST as well. Members and staff try to do their best to hear as many perspectives as we can, but as you can imagine, people are often working on a whole suite of issues, and the elected officials themselves, they may sit on specific committees, but they sit on everything, and so it is hard for them to hear from every single perspective, but we really try to do our best, and as staff, what we try to do is kind of filter some of that information and consolidate information to give people a summary of kind of perspectives. But we definitely definitely depend on perspectives coming from a higher, we're blessed in California to have both the CSU system and the UC system, as well as 2 national labs, have, a robust private sector of research and technology development, so all of the above.
Excellent. And Louise, can you give some tips to our audience on what you think would be, when somebody comes to you, when you are in policy, what was really helpful for you to receive? Give any tips on how to engage with policymakers in an effective way?
Things that are accessible and digestible, certainly. But I think one other thing that became really clear on a few programs that we deployed at the state level was we had an opportunity to create a new climate change research program. And it was one of those situations where we looked around and we were thinking, okay, what would make this different? This was at the Strategic Growth Council. We hadn't done a research program before, and so we built out a partnership-based climate change research program. And the intention of that was really to design a program where, from beginning to end, the research was done in partnership with a potential user. So that could be farmers, in the case of there was some innovative work being done on biochar, and so there was a partnership with the Almond Board, a research institution, and others to really think about how is this technology developing in a way that would be useful and usable by the intended audience. And so thinking in that way of not doing dropping information out there, but building information in partnership with folks who will be using it. And especially as we're thinking about emerging solutions, this is really important because we have to be doing work in a way that can actually be useful. So if we develop the best technology, but we can't put it into practice, it's useless. So that partnership approach can be really, really valuable for making sure that as we're producing new knowledge and information, it's ready to go. And I think can help us do things more rapidly as well by doing that along the way.
Great. And can you keep going on that line? Because I'd love for you to expand on how we can think about, of course, these are very long-term goals that we're working towards. Some of these technologies are going to be quite some time to be ready to go, not just because, maybe the technology's ready, but maybe the landscape isn't quite ready for it. Can you talk about some of the low-hanging fruit, some of the things that we might be able to work sooner on that can allow us to make some progress in parallel?
Yeah, I think obviously we're seeing tremendous progress being made, and we beat our 2020 target because we've been able to rapidly decarbonize in electricity generation through renewables, thanks in large part to places like Kern County doing the work that they're doing. We're seeing a rapid decarbonization in transportation, so we got to keep those types of things going. I think the other, I would be remiss, and I have several colleagues who would be very upset if I didn't mention methane emission reductions are critically important. We have a lot of low-hanging fruit there, and that, because it is a short-lived climate pollutant, helps to buy us a little bit of time. And so oil and gas is an important source of methane emissions, so we have people here in Kern County who can be helping with that, landfills and agriculture as well. So those are all places that are critically important that we're moving as rapidly as we can on those fronts so that it's giving us a little bit of time to figure out some of these more challenging topics.
And I'd love for you to weigh on this too, Marie. And before you begin, I want to let the audience know that I'd love to give all of you a chance to ask questions too. So get your questions ready.
I'm going to maybe answer a variation of your
Yes,
question
please.
in a little bit.
Make up your own question. It's okay.
In our going back to the big picture of how aggressive our climate goals are, our necessary climate goals are, it is the scoping plan that the Air Resources Board put together made an assumption that in order to get to our 2045 goals, I think it's a 94% reduction in fossil fuels by 2040. Now I'm going to be embarrassed that I can't remember whether it was by 2030 or 2045. But the point is a massive reduction in the amount of fossil fuel use. When one of the questions, kind of the kind of opening questions that we think about, that the legislature thinks about, and kind of how stakeholders many stakeholders that we work with think about, is that when we have technologies, that are coming forward that, kind of need us to change our regulatory and our statutory structure come forward. One of the questions is this going to help or potentially distract from that big goal of needing to reduce almost all of our fossil fuel use? And so when we look at CCUS in particular, going back to cement, for example, not only are how there's been a lot of consolidation of interest in that area is because we know cement's not going away. It's, our society uses massive amounts of cement. We know we need that for our construction needs, for our societal needs, and so that's a low-hanging fruit place for us to go, in a place where we can clearly go, and it's not in conflict with also our need to reduce the use of fossil fuels. And so that's often kind of a big framework question that the legislature often thinks about in trying to figure out how we should focus our regulatory and public dollar investments.
Excellent, thank you. All right, any questions in the audience here in person or online? Oh, yep. The mic is coming your way just so the people online will be able to hear you. Thank you so much.
Do you see it as a setback with the Federal Circuit Court overturning the ban on methane selection and choices for the policy initiatives that have come about to limit the choice of fuels for homes and things like that?
I think this is still playing out, and this will continue to play out. I think that this is, we under no uncertain terms need to decarbonize our building sector, and it's going to be hard to do that if, this is actually something California has grappled with for a long time now, that California as a subnational government has been far more willing to take aggressive climate action than we have on the federal level. If we have to wait for federal action on many things, including building decarbonization, we're not going to get anywhere close to what we need to do for climate change. So.
Yeah.
Yes.
Looks like George has a question.
Thank you. Marie, quick question. SB 905 placed a not insignificant set of tasks on mainly two agencies, the Natural Resources Agency and the Air Resources Board. Do you know where we are on implementation and whether these agencies are staffing up, where we are on schedule? How do we expect this to play out in the next few months or years?
I had a little trouble understanding the question with the echo. Did you ask me where we are on the implementation of 905, basically?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, so 905, we just passed it last year. State government, for better or any government, for better or worse, and moves not at the speed of lightning. There is actually a budget change, a budget proposal before the legislature this year that has a fairly sizable expansion for both the staff of the Air Resources Board as well as the California Geologic Society that I imagine we'll get through in one form or another, because we can't actually implement the government will not be able to implement 905 without those positions. I anticipate, and I work for the legislature, so I can't at all speak for the administration, but I think they've made it very clear that this is a high priority. So I fully anticipate them moving as fast as they can on this. This actually reminds me, one thing to actually point out on 905 that it was an important component was for the state to identify our kind of highest priority reservoirs that we should be using to hopefully avoid, so that we're kind of using the low-hanging fruit of geologic storage and not the, and use those safest places to kind of minimize the number of risks that we need to be thinking about.
Thank you.
Do we have time for one more question? Oh, and one from our online audience. Yes, please.
Yes, one question from the public is, what is the stance of policymakers on using CO2 for enhanced oil recovery?
Can you repeat that?
Yes, what is the stance of policymakers on using CO2 for enhanced oil recovery?
Actually, one of the most important aspects of 905 is that it's actually, sorry, it wasn't in 905, but it was in the package of bills, is that the use of CO2 for enhanced oil recovery is not considered sequestration for California. I think, this is definitely a different tact for California than the rest of the country has taken. I think it's really important for building the public trust that carbon sequestration is an additional tool, not just an excuse to use more fossil fuels. So will there still be enhanced oil recovery with CO2? It can, but it's not counted as a reduction.
Great, and I think that's all we have time for in terms of questions, although I know you're going to be here a little bit longer. Both of you have to travel back up to Sacramento or the Bay Area. I am so grateful for your time, your leadership in this space, your expertise, and for all of you for your questions, and I look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you so much.